Hi, everybody. Welcome to Shisai Podcasts, conversations between scholars from around the world who study childhood, youth, and related institutions historically. As an official production of the Society for the History of Children and Youth, you can subscribe to these shows through iTunes or Google Play. Written and visual materials associated with each episode are available at our website, shcy.org. Enjoy.
Okay, so I'm really excited to be here today. I'm Annika Herb. I'm joining Mel and Lykke for a discussion about their new book, Plants in Children's and Young Adult Literature. Before we begin, considering particularly we're talking about plants and nature, I'd really like to take a moment to acknowledge the country that I'm coming from today in Australia. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Pambalong clan of the Awabakal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd just like to hand over to you, Melanie, for a moment and to take time to introduce yourself, maybe a bit about your background and where you're joining us from today.
Hi, I'm joining you from Ghana land in Adelaide, and I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders past and present here. I've lived in Adelaide most of my childhood. I lived here, and then I ended up in Norway. So I now mostly live in Norway, and I'm working at Østfold University College. But currently, I'm a visiting researcher at the University of Adelaide, which is really great to be here again. Yeah, so that's all I'd say right now. I'll move on to Lykke.
I'm Lykke Guanio-Uluru. I'm a professor of literature at Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. So I'm based in Norway, and I would like to pay my respects to all inhabitants of this country, past and present, human and non-human. Yeah.
Beautiful. It's lovely to be able to, I think, all join across this international scope today and to have this discussion about this book and how it came about, where it's going as well, I suppose, because I'm hoping we can draw a few more eyes to it because it is a fascinating read and I think a really important one. So I'd like to really just jump straight in and ask you both about, I noticed a couple of really fascinating things. One thing I did want to draw our attention to was the dedication was absolutely stunning, I thought here, noticing it's a tribute to all the species of plants with which we share our lives every day and throughout our lives. Just the opening line of that. It's a rare dedication, I thought, but it just really set the tone for the book and maybe your intentions with it. I wanted to ask about how this book came about. So maybe your relationship to plants yourselves in your personal or scholarly lives. And you mentioned too in the preface that this book, it felt like it wanted to exist. So I wanted just to know the genesis of the book, maybe your relationship to plants, how it came about.
You want to start, Melanie?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's got a bit of a story. I suppose in my own life, I've always been aware of plants and aware of the non-human and aware that there are stories in the world that are different from the stories that humans tell. That there are other perspectives, I guess. And so this book, I suppose it had its seeds many years ago in a completely chance meeting between Lykke and I at the University of Oslo. And we were both there for a job interview in the cafe. And we just happened to sit down and strike up a conversation, which it's not something I normally do with strangers. So it just seemed to work, and we had a chat. And years and years and years after that, I was reading a book that Lykke helped to edit, called Eco-Critical Perspectives on Children's Texts and Culture. Is that right?
It's quite a mouthful, isn't it?
Yeah, so that was it. I was reading this and thinking I really want to move my own research into the area of children's literature and environmental literature. And I don't know where it came from, but I just thought, wouldn't it be great to have a book about trees? that was the thought that came to mind. And then I was reading Lykke's chapter in that book, which is about a Norwegian children's book and game or video, I don't know, character who is a tree stump. And the chapter was great. I was really impressed. I thought, I love this chapter. And at the same time, I was thinking, I wonder who could edit this book with me, because I felt like I couldn't really do it on my own. And then I looked at the name of the person who wrote the chapter and I thought, hang on, that's the person I met that time. And so I thought, right, she's the one. It's meant to be. I'm just going to email her out of the blue and say, why don't we edit a book on trees, was my initial thought. And Lykke said, yes, I was thinking of that anyway, but let's expand it to plants. And so I'll pass on to you now to see if you've got anything you wanted to add to that.
No, I think that's kind of shows the interesting backstory. And like Melanie, I've sort of a long relationship with plants, both personally and academically. So prior to that volume, that Melanie sort of recognized my name, and I did a book on fantasy literature. It was published in 2015, and one of the texts that I was reading was Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. And one of the things that I noticed working with it was the much commented upon Tolkien's deep relationships to trees. So I think that's how it usually starts out for a lot of people, with the relationship to trees. And then as you go deeper into that relationship, you develop an interest in other types of plants, and you start exploring more widely. It seems that we have this long-standing, in many cultures, we have this long-standing relationship to trees. And so it's like an entry point for a lot of people into the field of plant studies, I think.
Wonderful, thank you. I suppose then, digging a bit more deeply into the book there, I know it's got a whole range of people coming from a whole range of areas too, all over the world. So I was wondering just a bit about that scope. I'm also aware this is the first plant-centered anthology on children's and young adult literature, which is just a huge accomplishment, and amazing that it is the first, actually, I believe, because as we can see in the book, there's so many rich discussions ready to be, I think, sort of expressed further. So I know there's a question in there somewhere, but I basically just wanted to ask you a bit about that international scope, and potentially even to the structure of the book overall, how that came about. So did it come organically from the submissions? Did you have something in mind that you knew you wanted to explore there?
I think I'll let you start.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that it sort of grew organically from the submissions. We looked at the submissions and we saw that there were different areas within plant studies, within literature. So, but we wanted to keep it to the plant theme, of course. So all the sections of the book have sort of botanical or plant related headings. And that's something we did in the index as well, which might be a bit different from other volumes that we were to include sort of plants very specifically in our index words, which was kind of a nice process. What do you think, Melanie? Do you want to add anything to that process of shaping the structure of the volume?
Yeah, the structure. I remember you initially thought of the headings, and then we kind of based on the submissions we received, and then we had to kind of change them a little bit as the book kind of progressed. But I was really happy with how they turned out in the end. We start with this section called Botanical Fascinations, which I think is lovely wording. It was Lykke who came up with that title, and I really liked it, kind of focusing in on the details of plants and how that's used in various ways in literature. And then I think we moved on to plants in fantasy and myth, which was a really kind of big theme that came through, and so it was great to have a section on that. And then of course we move on to trees, because that was the largest section we had, as lots of people are really kind of interested in trees. And then I was really happy with the title we came up at the end, Plant Agency and Activism. To start with, we just had it about agency, and then we realised a contribution we had from the Philippines about activism really fit in there as well. But moving back to the first part of your question, which was about the kind of international scope of the volume, I'll let Lykke say something about this as well. But one thing that was really exciting when we kind of put out the call for papers was the amount of responses we got. I think it was like 45 or something abstracts initially, and from all over the world. It was really exciting to see the kind of interest in the field, I guess.
Yeah, we should have, we would have liked to, we could have made several volumes, but we ended up with contributions from Canada, Chile, Finland, Estonia, Germany, Hungary, the Netherlands, Norway, the Philippines, Poland, and Serbia. So it's quite wide-ranging geographically as well.
Which is amazing. I really want to emphasize too that this, as I said, it's the first plant-centered anthology in children's and YA literature. It obviously has a lot of intersections there as well in terms of, I suppose, that more general field of critical plant studies. So I wanted to ask, how does the book fit into that more general field of critical plant studies?
Well, it's critical plant studies is a field that's rapidly developing, I would say. So you have such a wide, it has a wide sphere of interest, like so many scholarly fields can intersect in the field of critical plant studies. You have botanical studies, which are revealing some really interesting new research on the behavior of plants. There's talk of plant intelligence that goes back to Anthony Trevava's, for instance. And you have work done by Monica Gagliani and Stefano Mancuso, which are significant names within those kinds of pioneering studies about the way that plants behave, that's changing the way that we look at plants. And that has kind of had a ripple effect upon the humanities as well. We start looking at our philosophies, our literatures, our cultural expressions, sort of seeing plants in a new way, and through that re-examining our own relationship to plants. So I think it ties in with both, as Melanie said, the field of eco-criticism and environmental studies, but also the post-human. And also, I think as the field is developing, decolonization studies, I know Kew Botanical Gardens are decolonizing their archives, for instance, and you're getting studies within the field of plant studies exploring those things as well. So one of the very nice things, and which I think that this book reflects about the field of plant studies, is that it's really an intercultural field, because there are plants everywhere on the earth, and all cultures have their relationship to plants, and most people too have a relationship to plants. So it's quite an inclusive field, like it's a welcoming field in that sense. Would you like to add anything to that, Melanie?
Yeah, that was great. And I suppose I would just add, like, in terms of, what's interesting about taking this field into children's literature studies is that, in some ways it's a perfect fit, because in in children's literature, you often get kind of anthropomorphism, you get fantastical elements, you have these amazing possibilities, even more so than in literature for adults. And in addition to that, you have kind of a cultural sense sometimes of children being like plants. You know, they're small, and you can plant them and nurture them, they can grow. You have those kinds of metaphors you can think about, or the idea that children are in some way close to nature, and they climb trees and will interact with plants in perhaps a different way than adults do. And so I think you can find lots of these ideas kind of in children's literature that makes it a really kind of rich field of inquiry in relation to critical plant studies. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that the two of you, sorry, Annika, but I just wanted to mention that Melanie and Annika are currently working on another volume on children's literature and plants from an Australian and New Zealand context, which I think really engages with that aspect of the indigenous perspectives. I think that's really interesting and important as well. I don't know if you want to say a few words about that.
Oh, would you like to jump in with that?
Yeah, I can start, and then if you wanted to add something, that's great as well. Yeah, I mean, after we, well, as I mentioned earlier, when we put out the call for papers on this volume, we got far too many abstracts than we could possibly work with. And we also wanted to have kind of a balance between the different countries. And it just so happened that both Lykke and I were writing about Australian topics in our chapters. We just happened to do that. And so we didn't really have space in the volume, it turned out, for more Australian chapters. But we received, quite a lot of great abstracts. And so I thought, look, you know, I really have to get back to this afterwards and kind of move it along and do something with it. And that's when I got in contact with you, Annika, as the person to do that with. And I think it's really interesting to have kind of a more kind of a local kind of and boundaries, I don't know if that's quite the right word, to focus on plants, life and literature from a particular region. And also we're really hoping in this volume to concentrate a lot more on in Indigenous literatures and perspectives, and to kind of decolonize this conversation kind of even further. Yeah, if you've got anything you want to add yourself to that, then that's great.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm really excited about it. I think it's obviously a really emerging area that gives us a lot to talk about. We did have a number of submissions there as well, very much focused on Australian landscapes, Aotearoa New Zealand landscapes as well. In particular, as Melanie, you just mentioned, that idea of opportunities to decolonise, what we've looked at with plants and plant studies in Australian and New Zealand areas. So we have a very particular history, of course, being an invaded country, of colonisation, a very colonial texts that have a particular way of mapping onto the land and trying to negotiate a very different Australian landscape in particular. And so we can see a real shift in terms of how we move from the colonial to, I will say, I guess, post-colonial, to texts that are Indigenous or actively trying to decolonise our perspective on plants there in relation to children and young adult literature. So we can see a real narrative that emerges throughout, which is quite beautiful, I think, and quite amazing to get to study. So I suppose that leads into my next question, which was just to see, where do you see scholarship on critical plant studies in children's literature going? Are there any other aspects? I mean, I suppose we've just said, great, there's another book coming out, hopefully not too far down the track.
Yeah, well, I think you can say that in a way that's a kind of a parallel to how eco-criticism developed as a field as well, because you had sort of a start in the States, and then it spread out, and you got later on an emphasis on different regional literatures, because obviously when we're talking about ecosystems, the local context is really significant. So I think definitely that's something that's sort of the word natural is sort of a contested word within eco-criticism, but it's a trajectory that's not surprising, to put it that way. I'm looking forward to all the different ways that the field will diversify. We had a few different entries on young adult literature, but not that many. So that's one field that I personally would like to see explored more deeply as well in relationship to plants. I don't know about you, Melanie.
Yeah, in terms of areas, I mean, we also had a really interesting chapter in our book on poetry written by children, and I thought that was a really interesting perspective in both respects. One, focus on poetry and vegetal poetry, I found really interesting. It's an area that I'm working on myself, but also focus on writing not just for children, but produced by children. Kind of opens up a whole new, a whole new area and questions, I guess.
And then ultimately, perhaps we'll get a volume about children's literature written by plants. So that's sort of the utopical horizon there.
I love that idea. I wanted to ask as well, because I know this is something in my own writing I have been struggling with a little bit, given that my background's more in young adult and children's literature. So I'm often placing the human at the center of my explorations. And I'm very much trying to shift that focus to thinking about the non-human and the more than human. So I wanted to ask, what steps did you take to ensure that plants remained at the center of this volume? Or was it something you struggled with at all, or completely fine?
No, the thing with this book was that how little of a struggle it felt. It was like it just it's sort of like overused metaphor, but it kind of grew in its own directions, and we were kind of just following alongside a little bit. Would you add anything to that, Melanie? Do you think that's a good description? I just felt like it's one of the sort of more light and interesting and effortless books that I've worked on. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was really a joy and to work with. I think it never felt like a chore. It was always always a nice thing to return to. I suppose in terms of keeping the plants at the center, occasionally we had to tell, in working through revisions of the chapters, sometimes we had to say, I'll just bring the plants a bit earlier. In your writing, focus first on the plants. And that's also something I think in our current book, in a couple of the chapters we're working with, we have to kind of help with that, I suppose, like just to really focus people on the plants early on.
And I guess right. when you say that, that's part of the editorial process as well, was that some of the contributions we didn't accept or we didn't choose to work with had sort of took a bit long to get to the plants. So obviously there's a process in our own thinking and in one's thinking when one starts working with the other than the human to you have to work through your own thought processes a bit to sort of arrive at the point where the plants are at the center, perhaps.
No, that's lovely. I suppose as we come to the end of our discussion, I wanted to ask just about any chapters you wanted to highlight that you found particularly interesting. I know all of them, I'm sure. It's like probably trying to ask you to pick a favorite child, but if there are any particular, or if you wanted to have a brief chat about your own chapters, I'd love to hear you do at least a summary of what you focused on yourselves.
Yeah, go ahead, Melanie.
Oh, me go ahead. Okay, well, I'll start with myself because that's easier. My own chapter was on, well, it's called Arboreal and Maternal Desires, Plants and Mothers in Australian middle grade fiction. And it just, that chapter as well, it just seemed to kind of want to exist. I'm interested in representations of the maternal anyway, but I just happened to read these 3 books published quite recently that all kind of linked or juxtaposed trees and mothers in really interesting ways, and in ways that seem to revise and question the really a well-known American picture book, The Giving Tree, which is about a tree that loves a little boy so completely that she's completely happy to get sort of hacked down in the end and to completely sacrifice herself. It's a kind of a strange book. It's quite loved and I think quite hated as well. But these Australian books were all, each of them was doing something quite different with trees and mothers, and it was just it was interesting to kind of think about that and what that meant and what possibilities were kind of encased in that. But in terms of other chapters, one I will just quickly highlight. I mean, I really like them all, but one that has been, it is, I think, quite new, is chapter 5 on magical plants in Serbian children's fantasy fiction, and that's obviously an area that I was not at all an expert in before I read the chapter, but it was so interesting to read about the historical and methodological heritage related to plants in that country, and how that has been kind of revisited, transformed, and reworked in contemporary fantasy fiction for children and young adults. And so I think that chapter is a really interesting one. Okay, I'll stop now.
So I think like you, that it's hard to highlight any specific chapters, because obviously we chose them all because we found them really interesting. But there are different chapters. There's one that's talks about Aristotle's relationship to plants, and doesn't really deal with children's literature that much, but it's in the book because criticism of Aristotle's scale of nature is like a figure within the field of critical plant studies. So we thought it was interesting to challenge a philosopher with an expertise in Aristotle to sort of defend him against these criticisms. So that's one chapter that attempts to contribute to the theoretical discussion within critical plant studies as well, in that sense. And I think that all of the chapters are interesting. So I'll do like Melanie to just basically say a little bit about my own chapter, because I've done an analysis of vegetable violence in the very popular Australian Treehouse series by Andy Griffiths and Terry Denton. And my son really loved that book series, so I've kind of read it a lot. But in this particular volume, in the 52nd story, Treehouse, there's actually this very interesting narrative that discusses the ethical position of plants in a sort of offhand way, or it's possible to read it in that way. And that ties in with one of my research interests generally, which is I like to look at things that are seemingly simple, but then if you look at them ethically, there are really a lot of ethically and aesthetically things are more complicated. So texts are quite open and quite intricate, even if they are children's texts, as we who are children's literary researchers know. But yeah, I think that in that particular book, it's like a petite histoire of plant studies and our ethical relationship to plants. So I thought that was really interesting to explore.
Absolutely. There's so many amazing chapters I found that just covered such a gamut of topics, which was just fantastic to see. So it was a really enjoyable read. I do encourage anyone to have a look at it, check it out. I don't think we mentioned briefly before too, I will mention there's another collaborator on Melanie and I's book that we're working on at Brooke Collins Gearing. And I did want to also highlight that Lykke has a chapter in that book as well that she's working on. So very excited to see what comes out of that too. I don't know if we mentioned it before. I did just want to ask, was there anything else that we haven't touched on that you'd really love listeners to hear about?
No, I think for my part, I would just sort of like to extend, you mentioned the preface to the book, and we kind of just see the book as a seed that we pass on, and then we're excited to see within the field of children's and young adult literature research what comes of that seed, like down the road. Yeah, we hopefully new and interesting research will sprout from it. So that's my parting wish, to put it that way. Sounds a bit morbid, doesn't it?
That's great, and I would just I would echo that. I think that's a great way to end. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for talking about this with me today. I think it's just been a really interesting discussion, and I'm so excited to see, I suppose, how this book takes root. I feel like this topic is just so rich for these metaphors and this language that we can use. So it's, but it does certainly instill a lot of ideas in readers and researchers in this area, and I think they can approach it from a whole range of directions and intersections, which is quite lovely. So we can branch off in a lot of directions there. But thank you both so much for joining me, and for everyone for listening along today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Shusai Podcasts. You can find more materials and features from the Society for the History of Children and Youth online, shcy.org.